How do you build a fortress? Not of stone and mortar, but of 100,000 tons of American steel. A fortress longer than 3 football fields, powered not by oil or coal, but by the heart of a star. A city at sea, destined to command the oceans. And yet, here is the riddle. How do you build such a titan not in the water, but on dry land? How do you create a ship inside a concrete basin surrounded by nothing but air? At first it feels like a paradox. A ship without water is not a ship at all. It is a monument, a silent sculpture of steel, pressed down by gravity, lifeless and immovable. And yet this is how the greatest warships in history are born. Before they ever sail, they spend their first years stranded on land, resting on keel blocks, dependent on the ground, on concrete, on the hands of thousands who build them piece by piece. This is the story of the USS John F. Kennedy, a Ford-class aircraft carrier, not just a vessel, but an island forged by human hands. Its life began in the hollow of a dry dock, a canyon carved from concrete. Inside those walls, sparks flew, cranes lifted, and steel plates were lowered with the precision of a surgeon. Year after year, the Kennedy grew taller, wider, heavier, until it became a city of steel waiting for the sea. For the workers, it was more than labor. Welders bent over glowing seams. Electricians crawled through narrow spaces, pulling wires that would one day power jet fighters. Engineers studied blueprints spread wider than dinner tables. Families carried the trade from father to son, mother to daughter. Newport News was not just a yard, it was a community. Each rivet, each weld, each measured cut was both work and inheritance. And yet, for all the effort, the Kennedy remained silent. On land, a ship is nothing but weight. It cannot fulfill its purpose until it is touched by water. That moment, the awakening, comes slowly, deliberately, not with a rush, but with patience. Millions of gallons are released into the dock with care. The sea is not an enemy here, but a midwife. As the water rises, it begins to share the load. Gravity no longer rules alone. The hull, once chained to the earth, begins to stir. For the first time in years, the Kennedy moves. It is a ballet of physics, a dance of buoyancy and weight, of patience and raw force. This is not just construction, it is transformation, from monument to ship, from silence to breath, from stillness to the possibility of motion. The Kennedy's first touch of buoyancy is not simply an engineering milestone, it is a baptism. But this leads to another question. Where can such a miracle take place? What kind of place can build a 100,000-ton fortress, then summon the river to set it free? To answer that, we must travel to Virginia, to the banks of the James River. There lies a shipyard unlike any other, a cradle of titans. Along the James River in Virginia lies a place unlike any other. For more than a century, it has been the forge of American sea power. Its name is Newport News Shipbuilding. To call it a shipyard feels too small. It is the only place in the nation with the skill, the scale, and the history to build nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. At the heart of this yard are the dry docks. They are not simple pits in the ground. They are modern coliseums, vast caverns of concrete where giants are born. Within their walls, steel is shaped into ships that will project American power across the globe. Dry Dock 12 is one of these places. It is the cradle of the USS John F. Kennedy. Over 2,000 feet long, 250 feet wide, it is a canyon carved by human hands. If you lined up nearly 500 school buses nose to tail, they would fit inside its walls. For 4 years, that hollow basin was the Kennedy's entire world. But it is not the size of the dock that makes this process remarkable. It is the way the ship itself is assembled. Many vessels are built in modules, large blocks joined together. But a nuclear carrier is different. It grows as one, layer by layer, from the very bottom upward, like a man-made mountain. Every section must be placed in precise sequence. Every pipe, every bulkhead, every circuit must come at the right time, or the entire process falters. Supporting this immense weight are the keel blocks, dozens of reinforced concrete pillars topped with wood, arranged like a forest beneath the ship. Together, they held more than 100,000 tons, the weight of 800 fully loaded Boeing 747s. For years, the Kennedy balanced on them, its entire mass pressing down into their silent strength. But these blocks are not just concrete, they are trust. Each one was set by shipbuilders with a craftsman's care. Many of them were sons and daughters of men and women who had done the same work for generations. They knew the risk. If even one block shifted, the ship above could suffer disaster. Every placement was an act of faith and precision. All around the dock, the work never stopped. Welders drew glowing seams across thick steel plates. Electricians wove cables through half-finished compartments. Crane operators swung massive sections into place with the calm steadiness of surgeons. Supervisors walked the catwalks above, blueprints in hand, eyes checking every detail. It was not a job for individuals, but a symphony of thousands, each part dependent on the next. For the Kennedy, this dock was both cradle and prison. Within these concrete walls it grew from raw metal into a vessel of war. But it could not remain here forever. The walls that protected it would also confine it. To fulfill its destiny, the dock would have to open. Water would have to be summoned. And a ritual older than any machine would begin. The deliberate, patient flooding that would awaken the ship. October 29, 2019. A crisp autumn morning in Virginia. The James River moved quietly, its waters calm and cold. Inside Dry Dock 12, the USS John F. Kennedy stood silent. For years it had rested on concrete blocks, a mountain of steel chained to the earth. That morning it was time for change. The flooding of a dock is not a sudden spectacle, no gates flung open, no tidal wave rushing in. To do so would be ruinous. Instead, it is a ritual of patience. Valves turn slowly. Water creeps forward in measured streams. It enters the dock inch by inch, rising against concrete walls. What seems like nature is in truth a controlled performance, guided by engineers who know that one misstep could cost billions. The first stage is quiet. 10 feet of water slide in, enough to kiss the bottom of the hull, enough to lap at the keel blocks that carried the Kennedy's weight for 4 long years. At that moment, everything halts. Divers descend into the dark water, feeling along seams and joints. Engineers crouch over monitors, tracking sensors for the slightest anomaly. Pressure gauges flicker, microphones listen for groans too faint for human ears. The water itself becomes an instrument, exposing flaws the dry dock could never reveal. Only when every test is passed does the process resume. Slowly, the water rises higher. It climbs along the hull, pressing gently upward, beginning to share the ship's immense weight. Gravity no longer rules alone. Steel, long frozen in place, begins to stir. For the first time, the Kennedy moves, not by human hands, not by cranes or cables, but by the quiet insistence of buoyancy. Imagine standing on the dock's edge. For years the ship was lifeless, an inert monument. Now it shifts, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniably. A city of steel, heavier than mountains, begins to float. It is physics made visible, the impossible becoming real. For the workers, the moment was personal. Thousands had labored toward this day. Welders bent over torches, machinists grinding plates, electricians threading cables. Now, as the water rose, their work was vindicated. Mike Butler, the program director, called it a special moment. And it was. Not only because the Kennedy floated, but because it did so ahead of schedule, 3 months earlier than planned. A triumph of planning, labor, and sheer human determination. As the dock filled with more than 100 million gallons drawn from the James River, the air itself seemed to change. Saltwater carried its scent into the basin. The Kennedy groaned and creaked, the sound of a body adjusting to its new element. Those who heard it compared it to breathing. For the first time, the ship seemed alive. But floating is not freedom. The Kennedy was still inside the dock, still hemmed in by concrete walls. It had taken its first breath, but it had not yet walked. Ahead lay the most delicate stage of all. The ship would have to separate fully from its blocks, drift clear, and be guided into position, without error. One wrong move could scar its hull, or worse, bring disaster. The water had awakened the Kennedy. Now came the test of movement. The ship was alive, but within its cradle it would soon have to become something more. A ghost in the water. There comes a moment when physics finally concedes its secret. Inch by inch, gallon by gallon, the water rises. The push upward meets the pull of gravity. And then it happens, the shift no one can miss. 100,000 tons of steel no longer rests on blocks of concrete. For the first time, the USS John F. Kennedy floats. It is both triumph and danger. The keel blocks, silent guardians for 4 long years, release their burden. The ship, once bound to Earth, now belongs to the water. It drifts slightly, not much, but enough to remind everyone watching that it is no longer a monument. It is a vessel. To the men and women in the yard, it looked almost like a phantom, a ghost moving silently within its cradle. But freedom inside a dry dock is a paradox. The Kennedy was alive, but vulnerable. Its mass was now carried entirely by water. Any careless misstep, a tug too strong, a rope too slack, could scrape that vast hull against concrete walls. Billions of dollars and decades of labor depended on inches, not yards. The next step required choreography, not brute strength. Tugboats idled nearby, their engines humming. Pilots and engineers coordinated every move. On the dock, men in hard hats gave crisp signals into radios. On board, technicians monitored balance and stability, ready to sound alarms if the giant shifted even a degree too far. To move the Kennedy was less like towing a ship and more like guiding a sleeping giant across a narrow bed. Slowly, carefully, the vessel was repositioned toward the western end of the dock. The tugboats pressed their bows against the hull, not pushing hard, but leaning steadily, like shepherds guiding a massive animal. Every motion was deliberate, every correction measured. It was high-stakes precision, where skill mattered more than force. And then came the ceremony. December 7, 2019, a date heavy with history. On that day, the Kennedy was christened. Caroline Kennedy, daughter of the ship's namesake, walked to the bow. In her hands, she carried a bottle of champagne. With a single swing, she shattered it against the steel. Bubbles and glass fell down the hull, a ritual echoing across generations. For her, it was a return. 52 years earlier, as a young woman, she had christened the first USS John F. Kennedy. Now she repeated the act, binding past and present. For the shipbuilders, it was vindication. For the Navy, it was tradition renewed. For the nation, it was pride made tangible. Applause broke out, echoing off the dock's walls. The ship, once silent and still, now carried a name, a spirit, and a destiny. Soon it would leave the basin, drift into the James River, and begin the long path toward service. Yet christening and floating are only the surface of its story. Beneath the steel deck, hidden from sight, lay something even more extraordinary. A technology that would redefine naval aviation. A revolution not of ceremony, but of science. The Kennedy carried within it a system that promised smoother, faster, more powerful flight. It was called EMALS, the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System. The Kennedy was more than steel afloat. What set it apart lived deep within its decks. For over 50 years, American carriers had launched planes with steam catapults. They worked, but they were brutal. Steam hurled jets forward with raw force, slamming pilots back into their seats, shaking airframes, punishing machines as much as men. It was power, but it was wasteful. The Ford-class carriers broke that cycle. In place of steam, they carried EMALS, the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System. Where steam roared, EMALS whispered. Beneath the deck ran long, linear induction motors, engines of magnetism. With the press of a switch, energy surged forward, invisible but immense, sliding an aircraft smoothly down the track. No clouds of vapor, no thunderous blast. Just a steady, controlled push. For pilots, the change was transformative. A steam launch felt like being punched by a giant fist. An EMALS launch felt like being lifted, guided, accelerated with care. One aviator described it simply, "It felt like flying, not fighting the catapult." Less strain on the body, less wear on the aircraft, more control for the Navy. And EMALS did more than soften the blow. It gave precision. Steam was bound by physics. It could only deliver a single kind of force. EMALS could be tuned instantly. Light drones, training aircraft, or heavy fighters loaded with weapons, all could be launched with equal ease. This flexibility meant the future fleet could adapt, blending manned and unmanned aircraft into a single striking force. The numbers tell the story. With EMALS, a Ford-class carrier can generate 25% more sorties than its predecessors, and it does so with 25% fewer crew. In combat, that means more aircraft in the air, more often, at lower long-term cost. It is not just an upgrade. It is a revolution in how naval aviation works. Yet revolutions rarely come smoothly. In its first years, EMALS stumbled. Reliability was low, the system breaking down more often than expected. Critics pounced. Billions had been spent, they said, on a dream that failed in practice. But inside the yard, engineers pressed on. They tested, repaired, logged every failure, and refined the system. Each breakdown was not the end, but a lesson. Better to fail in trials than in war. Slowly, the problems gave way to progress. New components replaced old. Software was rewritten. By the time the Kennedy systems came online, EMALS was steadier, stronger, and far more reliable. Its promise was intact, and its promise was vast. A carrier equipped with EMALS is faster, more flexible, and more efficient. It carries the ability to launch more aircraft in less time, with less strain, and with greater adaptability to the future. It represents a leap forward equal to the shift from coal to nuclear. But machines do not build themselves. Behind every cable and motor were human hands. Shipbuilders who laid the circuits. Technicians who tested the system again and again. Engineers who refused to give up after each setback. Without them, EMALS would have been nothing but theory. With them, it became reality. And so the story turns. To understand the Kennedy, one must look beyond its machines and into the faces of the people who made them. The human mainframe, the network of thousands, was the true power that brought this ship to life. Beneath the Kennedy's steel and circuitry lies its true foundation: people. Every weld, every circuit, every plate of armor exists because thousands of men and women bent their skill and strength to the task. A warship may be drawn by engineers and blessed by admirals, but it is built by human hands. And those hands are the real mainframe of American sea power. More than 3,200 shipbuilders worked directly on the Kennedy. Behind them stood a vast network of over 2,000 suppliers spread across the nation. A factory in the Midwest forged gears. A workshop in New England built electronics. Steel mills in the South rolled the plates that would become the hull. Each piece carried the pride of a community. Each shipment was a thread woven into a single tapestry at Newport News. For many workers, the ship was not just a project. It was a calling passed down through generations. Fathers teaching sons to weld, mothers showing daughters how to read blueprints or trace wires through narrow conduits. Families measured their lives not in years, but in ships launched. To walk the yard was to walk among legacies, craftsmen and craftswomen who saw their names, not in ink, but in steel. The work was unforgiving. Welders crouched in cramped spaces, sparks flying inches from their faces. Electricians hauled cables through dark, unfinished corridors. Machinists ground and tested parts with tolerances so strict that even a fraction of an inch could mean tearing out weeks of labor. Each task demanded focus, and the stakes were enormous. Someday, sailors would live or die by the quality of that work. And yet they endured. They endured because they knew what it meant. The Kennedy was not just another ship. It was a shield, a promise, a floating city that would carry America's sons and daughters across dangerous seas. To fail was unthinkable. To succeed was a matter of pride. Delays, too, were part of that pride. Outsiders sometimes saw them as failure. Inside the yard, they were choices. When a flaw was found, it was fixed. When a better system could be installed, the work was redone. Lessons from the USS Gerald R. Ford were folded into the Kennedy, even if it meant slowing the schedule. Perfection mattered more than punctuality. That is how trust is built, through patience and refusal to compromise. This devotion to excellence is why the Kennedy's delivery has been pushed back to 2027. Not because the workers lacked skill, but because they demanded more of themselves. Every well double-checked, every system tested, then tested again. The Navy's newest carrier would not leave the dock half-finished. It would leave better than the one before it. In an age of machines and automation, there is something remarkable about that truth. The most advanced warship in the world still depends on hands, eyes, and judgment. Computers can calculate tolerances. Cranes can lift steel. But only people can decide that a job is worth redoing. Only people can carry pride across generations. And that pride does not stop at the shipyard gates. When the Kennedy sails, it carries with it the work of thousands, the strength of communities across the nation, and the spirit of families who gave their lives to build it. But once afloat, the Kennedy is more than a ship or a workplace. It becomes something larger, a piece on the global chessboard, a force that can change the balance of power. When a 100,000-ton aircraft carrier slips into the sea, the world takes notice. It is more than a machine. It is sovereign territory, moving across the oceans at will. Its presence reshapes calculations in capitals thousands of miles away. To allies, it is reassurance, a promise that America's reach is real, that help can arrive when danger threatens. To adversaries, it is warning, a reminder that power sails quietly, beyond borders, beyond negotiation, visible on the horizon but impossible to ignore. A Ford-class carrier is not just a ship, it is a grandmaster's piece on the global chessboard. One move can change the game. Its deployment alters strategy before a single aircraft takes flight. Recent history proved this. When tensions flared in the eastern Mediterranean, the USS Gerald R. Ford and its strike group deployed. Within hours, a force greater than the entire air force of many nations was on station. No speech, no treaty could have spoken louder than the silhouette of that floating city. This is deterrence in its purest form, conflicts prevented not by words, but by presence. The numbers are staggering. A Ford-class carrier can host up to 90 aircraft, including the stealth F-35C Lightning II. Each jet can strike targets hundreds of miles inland. With EMALS, these planes launch faster, smoother, and more reliably. The result is more sorties, more reach, more endurance. A single ship carries the combat power of a small nation's air force, and it never sails alone. Around the carrier moves a strike group, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and supply ships. Together they form a shield and a sword, layers of defense against threats from air, sea, or beneath the waves, combined with offensive power that few would ever challenge directly. It is not a lone ship, it is a fleet in motion. Critics point to cost, billions of dollars, years of construction, entire industries mobilized. They ask, is it worth it? But the alternative is fragile. To project power without carriers would mean building and defending dozens of overseas bases, each vulnerable, each dependent on politics and logistics. A carrier needs none of that. It sails where it must, stays as long as it chooses, leaves when its mission is done. Flexibility, mobility, and presence, wrapped into one. For America, carriers are more than weapons. They are diplomacy made visible. They speak without words. They calm allies without treaties. They warn rivals without firing a shot. In a world where perception often shapes reality, the silhouette of a carrier on the horizon may be the most persuasive message of all. But the story does not stop here. The Kennedy is only one chapter in a larger design, a fleet built not just for today, but for tomorrow. Even now, new hulls rise from steel in Newport News, carriers that will carry the lessons of the Ford and the Kennedy into the future. The chess game continues. The question is not whether America will keep building. The honest question is how those future giants will be forged and what new powers they will carry. The Kennedy is not an ending. It is a link in a chain. The Ford-class program stretches far into the future, 10 carriers in all, built over decades, serving into the 2050s and beyond. It is a deliberate act of vision, a fleet designed to outlast generations. Already the next giants are rising in Newport News: the USS Enterprise, CVN-80, the USS Doris Miller, CVN-81. Their frames take shape where the Kennedy once stood. Sparks fly, cranes swing, steel grows into hulls that will sail for half a century. Each ship is more refined than the one before it. The Ford taught lessons to the Kennedy will pass lessons to the Enterprise to the Doris Miller. Step by step, the fleet evolves. This is not repetition. It is refinement. Systems improved, costs trimmed, efficiency gained. Each carrier is not a copy, but an improvement, an heir stronger than its parent. And these ships are built for tomorrow. Their nuclear plants produce more electricity than they now need. Today, they use only half their capacity. The rest is waiting, power in reserve for technologies not yet born. Railguns, energy weapons, advanced radars, unmanned squadrons. Whatever the future brings, the Ford class will have the energy to wield it. That is their genius. A ship launched in 2020 may still be in service in 2070. Across that span, the world will change beyond recognition. Yet these carriers are built with space and power to adapt. They are not fixed monuments. They are floating canvases, ready for upgrades that no engineer today can even imagine. But the program is more than technology. It is also symbol. The naming of CVN-81 carries a meaning as deep as any weapon. The USS Doris Miller honors a man who began as a mess attendant on the battleship West Virginia. On December 7, 1941, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, he manned a gun he had never been trained to use and defended his ship with courage. For his heroism, he received the Navy Cross, the first African-American sailor so honored. To place his name on the hull of a supercarrier is to make history. It is the first carrier named after an enlisted sailor, the first named for an African American. It tells every sailor, every worker, every citizen that courage and sacrifice matter more than rank. It is not only a warship, it is a message. In the yard, workers walk the half-built frames of the Enterprise and the Doris Miller. Torches cut steel, plates ring as they are set in place. Those sounds will echo into the future, because the ships they build now will still be sailing oceans long after their builders are gone. Each weld is not just metal, it is legacy, but for all the vision, for all the symbolism, the truth remains simple. Every carrier, no matter how advanced, must face the same ritual. Steel cannot sail until it meets water. A ship may be designed for tomorrow, but it must first survive its baptism. And that returns us to the essence of the Kennedy story, the weight of water. In the end, the story of a carrier comes down to something simple: steel and water. For years, the Kennedy was only steel, an immense body, silent, heavy, immovable. It stood on concrete blocks, a monument more than a ship. Then came the water. 100 million gallons drawn from the James River guided carefully into the dock. Not all at once, but inch by inch, hour by hour. With each rise, the ship changed. The crushing weight that had pressed into a few dozen blocks spread across the full length of the hull. The groan of strain softened into the creak of a body finding its balance. Steel was becoming ship. It was more than engineering. It was baptism. The Kennedy had been cut, welded, assembled, but only water gave it life. Only when it floated could it claim its purpose. For those watching, the moment felt alive. The sound of metal shifting, the sight of steel stirring, the feeling that a dream was crossing into reality. For the builders, it was vindication. Years of labor, of sparks and sweat, of nights under floodlights, all culminated in that rising tide. To see the Kennedy move for the first time was to know that sacrifice had meaning. For the Navy, it was proof that America could still summon giants. Delays and setbacks were part of the process. They were not failures, they were lessons. Each correction made the ship stronger. Each pause made the systems more reliable. Building a warship is not about speed, it is about trust. The Kennedy was never rushed, because lives would one day depend on it. When it finally left Dry Dock 12, sliding into the open James River, it was no longer a project. It was a warship, a guardian, a city of steel now carried by the sea. Its humble years on land were behind it. Ahead lay decades of service, patrolling oceans, deterring rivals, reassuring allies, carrying history across the waves. And perhaps that is the deeper truth. A ship like the Kennedy is not only steel or engines or weapons, it is will. The will of a nation to dream on a scale that seems impossible. The will to summon the labor of thousands and the resources of millions and to bind them into a single floating fortress. Steel alone cannot float. Water alone cannot defend. But together they create something greater, a bond as old as seafaring itself. Out of that bond rises a carrier, part machine, part symbol, part promise. When the Kennedy cuts through the ocean, it carries with it more than aircraft and weapons. It carries the spirit of those who built it, the vision of those who planned it, the pride of a country that still dares to build giants. And so, when we look upon that ship, when we see its silhouette against the horizon, we are reminded of a question. What does it take for a nation to dream at such a scale, and to turn that dream into 100,000 tons of reality?